Hello. So let's see, share screen, go over to Mimetics and share. Okay, so we're going to finish this lecture today, obviously, since there's not that much left, and then we'll see how I feel subsequently because I've been I didn't sleep well last night, and the election kept me up late and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, it appears like Donald Trump will no longer be the president of the United States, and that is a reason for celebration. And as long as you're not, totally enchanted with Donald Trump. Anyway, so let's see. We were talking about additive versus synergistic outcomes of collective behavior. And so additive outcomes in collective behavior is basically that the group's collective response is just the sum, non-interacting properties of all of its constituents. And I was referring to how uncommon that was. So we talked about the sandpipers, how the first few individuals that flee in response to that Vishla would catalyze escape behavior, flight behavior in their fellow group mates because they acquire social information about they socially acquire information about the threat environment by their most fearful conspecifics in their group. All right, so like an analogous example might be something like in these paper wasps on the right-hand side here. So how many paper wasps are deployed to to somebody who's molesting the nest, or maybe let's pretend that this paper wasp nest is underneath a picnic bench and you don't realize that it's there. And so you sit down to have a picnic or a bonfire. Canadians love bonfires, so like bonfires or something. And you don't realize that this paper wasp nest is there. And some proportion of this nest, some proportion of its group members are going to sting you. But how many are going to sting you? Well, if it's an additive property of the collective of the group, then each of these individual workers will have a probability, a 1 in 4 chance, we'll say, of flying off and stinging you. And so that would be, whatever the number of individuals in that group times 0.25, i.e. divided by 4, will tell you the number of individuals that, based on an additive response, assuming all individuals have an equal probability of attacking you, of what the collective outcome of the group should be. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wasps here. So 1.25 of them should sting you on average. Should fly off and sting you. That's the additive outcome. But the synergistic outcome might be something like an individual's probability of flying off and stinging you might be contingent on whether or not other individuals in their group have flown off and stung you. So they might get agitated by the movement of their fellow group members, and that might increase that 0.25 probability of them flying off and stinging you dramatically. Or what if they have alarm pheromones? The first one stings you, and now you have an alarm pheromone on you. That increases the probability of each other individual flying off and stinging you enormously. So suddenly you might get 100% of these individuals to sting you. They'll all fly off and attack you. Why? Because they might respond to each other's behavior either just by observing each other visually or through alarm pheromones or just general agitation. There's just buzzing and vibration around the paper wasp nest. And those papery nests are brittle enough and tight enough that they can feel the vibrations and agitated movements of their fellow colony members. So there you go. There's a very good chance that a lot of these things will sting you and that it will be a non-additive property of that group versus each individual on its own might only have a 1 in 4 chance of flying off and stinging you. All right, let's imagine one last example with non-human animals about additive versus synergistic outcomes. House hunting and ants. So in a lab, house hunting is instigated with ants by putting them basically in little colonies between 2 microscope slides and just a giant square bit of balsa wood with a hole that allows these ants to crawl in and out, right? And they have a little cover slip there, and that's nice, and that protects them from the external environment, and they feel happy to have this home. It has a tight entrance here that's easily defensible, and it's compressed into a planar structure, which is conducive for organizing the brood, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a fine little home for them. However, oftentimes in nature, these ants, we'll say that these are acorn ants here, will live in acorns that get crushed by predators, by herbivores, by whatever, just ambient individuals walking around having a spring walk. humans might step on these acorn ants' homes and crack them, or just they'll degrade with time and get weathered, and they'll need to find a new home. And the question then becomes, when these ants go house hunting, does the house selection properties of the colony, are they rather a additive or synergistic outcome of the behavior of the workers? You can test this in lab by just lifting off that top slide, and then the ants will have air exposure to the top of the colony. They don't like that. They'll feel breezes and things, and so they'll become agitated, and they'll just start looking for a new home. Because you're an experimentalist, you have other little balsa wood and microscope slide options for them to move into. And we'll say in this case, you have identical options. They have the same entrance width. Ants like to have a tiny little entrance to their colony, so big gaping entrances, not interesting to them because those aren't as defensible. But teeny tiny little entrances, they like that, and then they want to have a large internal chamber to produce to have their brood, and they want to have a dark environment as well. But we're giving them equivalent options. So, where does the colony go? Well, each ant, if it can assess both options, will have a 50-50% chance of entering one of those options versus another if they're equivalently spaced from the colony. And so if the colony moved using strictly additive properties, then we would imagine the colony should move into those two options and be totally split. But that is not what they do, because guess what? Just like in all these other examples, these social group members, these tiny little workers, are attending to each other's information, presence, and abundance. And so what we get is we get ants that move into those two little homes, and then they will begin to move some brood into those two homes, but quickly they'll learn that other members of the colony are going someplace else, and they tend to have conspecific attraction. So that means that members of the species tend to prefer to be around members of their group. So what happens? Even small differences in the initial number of individuals that go to one of those options, there are 10% more individuals over here than over to this option. New colony members that begin to make their movement decisions are more likely to join larger chains of individuals. They're more likely to join where other group members are currently bustling back and forth between. And so you suddenly get a giant cohesion that even though these options are totally equivalent, and the initial number of individuals might have been totally equivalent moving between those two options, just by chance alone, a small number might start a small increase in the relative representation of individuals in this chain might increase, or this chain might increase. But because other workers in this group tend to join larger chains of individuals, means that very quickly the colony will reach a consensus, and almost all of the individuals will go into this colony here. And the other individuals, the small number that were initially moving over here, assessing this other nest, will recognize that there's more individuals moving over here and then join them. So you get a unified decision rather than a split decision, which is what we would imagine based on strictly additive properties alone. You get the gist. So social feedbacks. What I've talked about here inadvertently in all of these examples are social feedbacks, where the probability of any one individual of the group engaging in a kind of behavior changes based on whether or not other individuals are engaging in that behavior. So the definition is the actions of group members change the probability of others engaging in the same action in some way. Positive feedback loops are where the probability of any group member engaging in a behavior increases based on the representation of that behavior already present in the group, i.e. how many other individuals are already instigating that behavior, engaging in that behavior. So imagine mobbing here. So we have this group of corvid birds mobbing this poor owl, and if it's just one individual, the first individual to start mobbing actually might have a pretty low chance of mobbing, right? Maybe it's a 1 in 10 chance, maybe it's a 1 in 20 chance that this bird risks flying off and attacking a predatory bird like this owl. However, once that individual starts mobbing it, the probability of any other individual starting that behavior is greater than the probability that the first individual would have started it. And then the next individual has an even greater probability of joining mobbing behavior. And the next individual has an even greater probability of joining mobbing behavior, which is how we get these giant collective responses where every member of the group mobs this owl, and not just the most aggressive individuals in this corvid group, or the ones that are the boldest, but it's just total behavioral conformity, that the probability of other individuals joining in that kind of behavior increases based on the number of their fellow group members that they can detect engaging in that same sort of behavior. So like begets like. All right, enter negative feedback loops. Negative feedback is that the probability of the next individual engaging in that behavior goes down relative to the number of individuals that are already engaging in that behavior. So if there are a lot of individuals engaging in that behavior, the next individual tends not to engage in it. So an example of this might be something like division of labor and colony defense inside of social insect colonies, where if individual members of the social group can tell that there's already lots of foragers out there, then they're not going to go attend to foraging behavior. Or if they can detect that there's lots of individuals feeding brood and that the brood are all being fed, those workers will tend to go do something else. Why? Because that job is already getting done. And if it's already getting done, you can tell a lot of individuals are doing that task, and that means it's not a task that you need to be doing. You need to go find work that other members of this group are not engaging in. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop. The probability of me feeding this brood is negatively related to the number of other individuals I can detect that are feeding this brood item. Positive feedback loops, generally speaking, are probably more common in behavioral dynamics of social groups. At least they're more intuitive for me. But there are both positive and negative feedback loops, and they're important in determining what whole groups do. Bit of a sip of Diet Coke. Man, I feel like total garbage right now. I hope my energy's up because I feel like crap. If I miss my bedtime's about 10:30, 10, sometimes 9:30. I'm old. And so if I miss my bedtime, my sleep just goes to hell. Anyway, it's gonna happen to you too one day, so just you watch. And I also cannot nap. I'm a pathologically poor napper. I'm not gonna nap ever in my life. Okay. Enough about my napping habits. Right, so let's go back to social feedback loops involving humans. So COVID-19. COVID-19 has had some negative impacts on the business world and commerce and foot traffic. Behold, and what is in front of you right now, and probably familiar with most of you, is the Eaton Center in Toronto. I'm familiar with the Eaton Center because while I was living in Toronto, I'm not really, I don't have a high aptitude for contending with cold weather. And so I would wander through the Eaton Center and the little underground, financial district series of corridors, like a weird underground mall. I don't know what you call that thing. The weird underground mall thing that allows all the bankers to get around. That's basically where I live when I live in Toronto. I'm basically a Nosferatu, wandering around beneath the ground. Wait, how did I get on this topic? Oh yeah, that's right. So the Eaton Center is an incredibly prosperous mall that has been negatively impacted by COVID. So because there were socially transmitted infections wandering all over the place and reaching reasonably alarming numbers in Southern Ontario, nothing like the United States, but reasonable numbers that Ontario decided to close down many shops. And so the Eaton Center closed down. There's a problem though, because if you've been to enough malls, you've quickly become to realize that there are certain qualitative states that malls can be in. There are prosperous malls that are filled with nice stores and people bustling around all over the place and enjoying their time and spending money and going over to EB Games or EV Games and wandering into some fancy Gucci place and never buying anything there and then going on Poshmark and purchasing it instead. Anyway, but people wander around the mall and they spend a lot of money, right? It's incredibly prosperous. However, there's another alternative stable state of many malls, and that is derelict. This in front of you was probably once a very prosperous mall. I think this is either in Pennsylvania or Ohio, but there are famously a huge number of malls that are just completely derelict in the United States where there are no open stores. And if someone were to open a store in this mall in front of you, guess what? No one would go because there's just one store and no one wants to go wander around a mall to go into one store. And because there's no one there, that business is unlikely to take hold and become prosperous. And so you can see here already that like begets like, right? So you have something like a high-end busy mall with lots of traffic that moves around that comes to visit the mall because there are so many shops that you can go into, right? And so they come there to just sort of wander around and socialize. And the probability of them having some sort of impulse buy while they're there is much greater because there are many options and that draws in more people, right? However, if the number of options to the stores goes down, the foot traffic goes down. And once that goes down, the kinds of stores that can subsist under low foot traffic become fewer and fewer. And so they sort of start going extinct, these stores. The ones that require the highest levels of of foot traffic are the ones that vanish first. They go out of business first, or they relocate first. And then once they disappear, some number of individuals that went to the mall were only going for those stores. And so once those stores are gone, those people don't go to the mall for that purpose any longer. And so the foot traffic goes down. And incrementally, when that foot traffic goes down, there are other businesses that could have survived if the foot traffic had just been a little more common, but then suddenly the foot traffic is below their threshold to survive. And so those kinds of businesses vanish, and then so on and so forth. And you reach a positive feedback loop where stores that go out of business that are in these giant shopping centers, indoor shopping centers, facilitate the demise of their more resilient neighbors. So stores that have tight margins, stores that require lots of foot traffic and impulse buys, those are the ones that are the most susceptible. But eventually, the number of people who go to the mall can become so depleted, so rare, that even the most battle-hardened stores go out of business. And then the next thing you know, you've got an empty food court. It looks like there should be a zombie apocalypse in here or something. And it's kind of funny because there's snow that's made it into this place because all the glass has been broken in up top. Anyway, these are really big problems in the Midwest United States. Once very prosperous areas, not so much any longer. Enter COVID. COVID has managed to make a lot of businesses go out of business, go bankrupt, close their doors. So, and the ones that seem to be the most susceptible to this sort of collapse are things like Neiman Marcus or Nordstrom or movie theaters, right? So movie theaters went away because people can't sit around in congested rooms, breathing all over each other, straining to breathe, making loud crunching sounds. Anyway, I hate public movie theaters. But they're just airborne pathogen petri dishes, right? So of course they got closed down, and these giant Nordstrom and Neiman Marcus type stores, they require lots of foot traffic to stay there, to stay present. They have huge square footage that they have to support fiscally. So if people just stop going to the mall, or even are even depleted momentarily, they have huge overheads that they cannot cover. And so it's not surprising that I think it was Neiman Marcus filed for a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So why do people go to the malls? Well, even though many people don't go to the mall and buy from Neiman Marcus, wandering through a Neiman Marcus and ogling at all the expensive attire and accoutrement is actually quite entertaining. You're like, oh, how many things can I not really afford? So once these big giant stores like Neiman Marcus or Nordstrom go out of business, then the foot traffic that's available for all these ancillary stores, say a Hot Topic because you have a penchant for Pokemon shirts, or GameStop because, again, you would like to go play video games because there's nothing else to do with COVID, those stores suddenly have such low levels of foot traffic that even they are likely to go out of business. Movie theaters, giant department stores, they have huge rental overheads, and they are signed into giant long-term leases. And so when foot traffic becomes depleted, even for a short period of time, a pulse of a few weeks, you run the risk that some of these branches will go out of business. They will no longer be profitable. And if the foot traffic is reduced for a long period of time, then they're very likely to go out of business permanently. And once those major keystone stores vanish, the foot traffic goes down and it begins to choke off other places until the last thing that's available is a Cinnabon, and no one's going to go wander around the mall for hours and hours and hours and then eat Cinnabon, unless you're like me and you mall walk. Anyway, positive feedback loop and socioeconomic dynamics that can be initiated by things like just a couple of weeks where stores can't be open. I'm not suggesting that the Eaton Center, by the way, is going to enter this state. There are so many people that have to walk through the Eaton Center just because it's the only hospitable, humane way of getting around certain blocks. And it connects the subway to the underground, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so I'm not saying the Eaton Center is going to go out of business, but this is a positive feedback loop of economic collapse on a small scale inside of shopping centers that occurred all over the United States. All right, so collective decisions are less error-prone. Wow, I've actually eaten up a huge amount of time. Okay, so collective decisions are less error-prone. Why would you want to make a decision as a group? Why are groups so good at coming to the best option or a better option than individual members of the group are? Well, lots of social animals rely on collective decisions. And there are reasons why groups make better decisions than singleton individuals. Statistically, even the most brilliant animal in the world, you're one of the most brilliant animals in the world. You are. I feel like Mr. Rogers. Anyway, so there's a chance that when you're given two choices, you're going to make the wrong choice. You're going to pick the inferior option. It might be very small because you're a highfalutin cerebral animal that's capable of evaluating lots of options and lots of axes. But you still have a chance of failing at this. Now imagine you're an ant and you have a memory of about 10 seconds and you can really only tell whether it's light or dark outside and you kind of bumble around. Your error rate's probably much greater. But yet if you look at colonies of ants or colonies of social insects when they're making collective decisions, they're very efficient at picking out the right option. How do they do it? When each ant is actually pretty stupid. All right, so individual ants, dumb. Groups, smart. And why is that? Well, groups average the failure rate of their group members. So even though each ant has like a 1 in 4 chance or a 1 in 2 in 5 chance of picking the inferior option, the colony, once it has hundreds and hundreds of individuals making that choice, well, 60% of the group is going to go towards this better option. And if ants are still able to pay attention to where the majority of the group is going, they will tend to congeal around the superior option. And larger groups tend to do this even more effectively because you're basically saying, yeah, we know that there's a chance that each individual ant will do something stupid, but hundreds and hundreds of ants will have at least a greater probability that the majority of ants will make the right decision. And so just by allowing those multiple sensors that have an error rate to detect the environment and then to congeal around the most commonly selected choice allows an ant colony to make really efficient, difficult decisions effectively and efficiently. Difficult and subtle decisions effectively. There we go. Pardon me, I'm less articulate than I normally am. Okay, so sharing information. So, I mean, with that ant example, the only information that they're really sharing with each other is like, where the other ant's going. And that's still information, but it's not highfalutin information, right? There's not a lot of detailed elements there. They're just sort of mixing conspecific attraction with an error rate. So that's why it's sort of been that first set of category, that first sort of narrative of the benefits of collective decision-making as a statistical property, rolling the dice over and over and over. Okay, once you share information in a more explicit way, the group is even more effective at making subtle, complicated decisions with high efficiency. So having many individuals means that you just have more sensors that can look at all the options in the environment. So you don't typically have just 2 choices in whatever you're going to do. You probably, in the leaf litter, have dozens or perhaps 100 different options of where to move your colony. A singleton ant is never going to be able to figure out what's the best option among these hundreds of options. Because remember, that ant's pretty stupid. So it can only remember things for a few seconds, right? Maybe a minute. So there's no way that one ant could wander around, look at all those options, digest them, and make a decision. But by having hundreds of ants wandering around in that environment, even though each individual ant is only detecting a small subset of the available options, the group in aggregate is scanning the environment very broadly. Add conspecific attraction, and suddenly that group will tend to congeal around options that are far better than the average random option in that aggregate, and it will make a much better decision that a singleton ant wandering around on its own will tend to deploy. Okay, then they can also do info sharing, like ants can do things like tandem runs. Like if an ant thinks that it's found a really, really nice home, it goes back to wherever it came from, where its colony member is, and it does something called a tandem run. It antenates rubs its antennae, like pats them on the head of another worker, and then that instigates that second worker to follow it. And then the first ant goes around that meandering course and shows the second ant where the option that the first ant thought was quite good is located. And so you can, one member of the group can basically say, I found something, let me show you. And they do that. And that enhances the probability that the next ant will, 1, discover the resource, 2, evaluate it for itself, and 3, make a semi-independent decision on the quality of that option, right? So now individual members of the group can actually guide other members to where they think the best options are. And presumably the frequency of that, basically it's voting using these tandem runs, the frequency of this voting can rapidly cause a group to congeal around a superior option. And then finally, there's out and out voting where you can veto and endorse options where even things like honeybees. So like when honeybees are looking for a new place to deposit their queen and colony after a swarm event, the individual workers of these honeybees basically tell the other group members where they were, in which direction their potential nest site is located, and how its quality by basically flying in an ellipse over and over and over. And the more elongate that ellipse is, and the sharper it points, the more enthusiastically individual group members are voicing their opinion about the prospective nest site they found. So if an individual worker finds a nest site and it's just sort of so-so, it will tend to produce a very almost circular, but just slightly ellipsoid flight paths that will point a small number of individuals of that group in that direction. If an individual group member, though, thinks it's found like the bee's knees, the bee's knees awesome site, well, then suddenly it'll make a very sharp ellipsis that's quite dramatic, and that's basically giving an enthusiastic vote. So it's not just that these colony members can say, I found something, come see, and endorsing it in a 1-0 sort of on-off sort of capacity. These individual colony members can say, I found something and I'm going to give you my assessment of its value. And other members of the group can then go to check that for themselves and then make their own independent vote. If they thought it was crappy after somebody was enthusiastically voting for it with a strong ellipse, then they don't engage in the ellipse at all, or they just do a general circle. If they also agree, though, that new colony site over there is wonderful, then that second bee will make a very strong ellipsoid path, and that will increase the odds that other group members will go along that path and find that nest site and vote for themselves. And very quickly, you can get many bees voting from many ellipsoids pointing in different directions to a small number of ellipsoids that are very, very pronounced. And then all of the colony members are now only focusing on those small number of highly enthusiastic votes, and then making decisions for themselves. So very quickly, a colony will go from evaluating lots of options that it's uncertain about to a so-so number of options that it feels somewhat strongly about to only 2 or 3 options that colony members are generally quite enthusiastic about. And then finally, they congeal around one option, usually the best option, and then they go find it. And these are bees. Like, they don't live that long. Few weeks, couple of months. That's about it. They're not that smart. They're not doing calculus, and yet the colony in aggregate can evaluate an incredibly complex 3-dimensional landscape over the course of miles, and then select reliably really, really good options for placing their nests, their new nests, once they produced a new queen and they're swarming. So yeah, so there's just the many sensors sort of element. There's general voting 1-0. I like this thing, I don't. And there's even qualitative elements to communication. And there are things in ant colonies where they have like headbutts where other members of the group can basically say, no, you've made a bad decision. This is not a good option. But those are basically voting against somebody, voicing an opinion against somebody else's endorsement is a rarer property of groups. Normally it's just, I either independently decide to corroborate your opinion or I don't. But sometimes they can actually vote down the view of another. We do that all the time. Ants and bees, not so much. Bees do it, but just it's not as important as you might imagine. Anyway, so this unit covered a variety of topics. We covered social learning, we covered cultural evolution, transmission of information, how it is cultural evolution happens, the foibles and costs of living in a society and as an organism that's quite susceptible to social information, and the issues that might cost both an individual member of the society and then the whole society at large, and then why it is just collective dynamics in general tend to be really helpful, and the sorts of feedback loops that give rise to them. The next lecture is the complexity lecture, which is probably, so I know this is our last thematic lecture, and then we'll just do the natural history, walk through as many different organisms as I can at the level of detail that time permits, sort of like a review of all the cool animals on planet Earth. But this is the pinnacle of highfalutin conceptual topics in social evolution, and it's a region of behavioral ecology that unites concepts from ecology and physics and mathematics and economics. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of these concepts from the standpoint of animal sociality and animal behavior. But the reality is that almost every one of these topics that we're going to talk about could as easily be discussed in an engineering class, a physics class, or a mathematics class. So I think it's worth noting because complexity theory is such an octopus discipline and framework that manages to innervate lots and lots of different fields of science and soft sciences as well. So with that, I will leave you be. Have a good day. Take it easy. This turned out being much longer than I anticipated. Bye-bye. But for real, goodbye.